Mind Bend. Non-ordinary and extraordinary states of consciousness for Mind Bend Creative.
We met at the Wonderland conference.
We did.
And you were busy.
I was extremely busy that week, yes.
Yeah, and you were celebrated.
It was nice to be celebrated.
Did you have a celebration experience for yourself?
In the aftermath, yes. It was very interesting for me, actually, because I'm emotionally quite an intense person. I feel all the feels all the time. And in this situation, it wasn't that I wasn't allowing myself to feel the emotions. It was more a deep focus on delivering. Because this week, last week in Miami, was the culmination of not just an incredibly intense period creatively in recent times over the last month or so. It's been the culmination of years, really, of thinking, feeling, theorizing, experimentation. So when I actually got to Miami, something very interesting happened. I just became very calm and deeply neutral. And having experienced like no strong emotions either way. So it was quite funny because like all my friends who knew what I was doing over here are all like texting me and sending voice messages, like losing their shit. Like, oh my God, you must be so excited. And you know, you must be so proud of yourself. And I'm like, it's cool. Like, it's cool. Like I'll genuinely absorb it and integrate it after I've done it. Because the most important thing right now is to allow it to happen. To deliver it in the right way, with the right intention, and with the right spirit, so people can really pick up on that and really resonate with it. And yeah, it was pretty successful from that point of view. And then on Sunday, I allowed myself to just flow with those feelings, be able to reflect on a job well done. And when I say a job well done, I mean, congratulations, you stayed completely out of your own way.
Yeah, well, you were brought there. You were asked to come to speak on a panel, and to also, is it safe to say, DJ a couple of events, celebratory events, after parties. One for Maps,
Correct.
And then another the night before, I believe, the awards ceremony for Microdose Wonderland. So that's cool to get that invitation. It must be somewhat of a recognition. But tell me about what led up to getting connected with Wonderland and being visible on their radar.
Yeah, as I say, it's been a culmination of a 6-year journey. So I am obviously a DJ and a music producer, predominantly working in electronic music in the quote-unquote EDM scene, as Americans like to call it, which is a term I viscerally hate. But I work in the electronic music industry. It's been my passion for the last 20 or so years. And what's great is Richard Scaife, the guy who is kind of the guy behind Wonderland and Microdose, is actually from that world as well, and had promoted parties, and me and him had a very similar background. Actually, Liverpool.
Is he from Liverpool?
He's not, but he used to live in Liverpool.
Okay.
And we actually knew a lot of the same people.
Nice.
So we were connected earlier this year by a dear mutual friend of ours, Tristan Hunt, who I have a lot of beer to buy for him after this, with this connection. He connected me to Richard, and one thing led to another. But the beauty of it was all of my experiences that I've had with non-ordinary and extraordinary states of consciousness, as you put it, over the last 20 years has culminated in my experiences with psychedelics over the last 6 or so years, which was a process I had to submit myself to humbly because I had work to do, as we all do, right? So that is massively integrated into my life in every aspect: relationships, creativity, the whole 9 yards. It's completely transformed my life and allowed me to feel safe to become the person that I'm meant to be. And the opportunity that Wonderland presented was to give me a platform and to give me a showcase, to show the music that I create, the intention with which I create it, and to be able to communicate it to as many people as possible within this really exciting new realm that's opening up in legalizing psychedelics for therapy and for therapeutic use. And, you know, I think you saw me talk on the panel on Thursday, and one of the things that I was trying to get across is, you know, we may not look at it this way, but a dance music setting in like a club or a festival is deeply therapeutic. And that's why certain compounds like MDMA, for example, work incredibly well in that setting. And if it's done correctly, it's deeply healing and transformative.
Coming up, were you going to raves or dance halls or underground experience? Okay, so that was part of your upbringing.
Yeah, very much so. So in Liverpool, obviously, it's a big music city. Obviously, everybody in America defaults to the Beatles, of course, and that's a big part of it. And obviously, we still get a lot of tourism for those guys, which is great. And, very appreciative of their part in the journey.
How many people live in Liverpool?
Only about 400,000 people.
Okay.
So we punch incredibly above our weight in terms of what we output culturally, creatively, musically, because it's not just the Beatles, but in electronic music in particular, that is one of the things that we do the best. So I lived and still live in Liverpool nominally, although I kind of live out of a suitcase these days, especially now after the pandemic, things are back to normal for me. I lived about 10 minutes away from one of the great clubs, one of the first what you would call super clubs. So the first one was Ministry of Sound, and then after that there was a club in Liverpool called Cream. So I lived about 10 minutes away from there. So going to Cream and having these incredible transcendent experiences every week was a bit like for the layman being able to go down to the local pub. Mm-hmm. It was on every week, and people flocked not just from the rest of the country to go to that club. People flocked internationally. People flew into the country.
Was it just a given since you were so close, you were going to be winding up spending time there?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, again, there's a lot of variety because obviously the rock scene's really strong in Liverpool. There's some amazing bands that have come through in like the last 20 or so years, like the Zootons and a load of others. And, there's a great kaleidoscope of musical talent. But I actually refer to Liverpool as the Berlin of England because it's just one of the epicenters of electronic music, and there's so much talent and there's so much opportunity because it's quite a cost-effective place to live. It's deeply cultural. We're very anti-establishment. We don't like being told what to do by the government or by the royal family or anything else. Very independently minded. And I kind of explain it to people who have never been there. It's a bit like Barcelona in Spain, where it's like, you're in Spain, but it's not Spain. And actually, I'll tell you this quick anecdote. We have a museum of the history of Liverpool. And I can't remember the exact politician who said it, but it's a sign that hangs on the door of the Museum of Liverpool, which charts the over 800-year history of this city. And as I like to say to a lot of American people, my city is 3 times older than your country. So there's a lot there, good and bad. But this sign says, the best thing about Liverpool is that it's not England. And that's how we kind of approach it. People ask me like, oh, where are you from? Liverpool, England. No, Liverpool. Like it's almost like it's an independent state of consciousness. And I don't know whether you know this, but obviously you're familiar with Carl Jung.
Yeah.
Carl Jung had a dream about Liverpool and he wrote about it. And he said, it is the center of the known universe.
Is it a ley lines sort of situation?
Well, Liverpool, the pool of life.
Yeah.
So he actually wrote about that.
Yeah.
And he said he never went to Liverpool, but he said it's so clear, like the center of all consciousness is in this place. And it's very clear when you're in the city, it's very clear there's a collective consciousness about the place.
Have there been any other notable philosophers or authors who have alluded to the thriving universal brain that resides?
Not off the top of my head, but I think that explains the incredible amount of cultural output that happens in that city because it's such a melting pot. So, obviously, there's big touch points conversationally and societally nowadays about, diversity and multiculturalism. Yeah. Liverpool was the single greatest experiment in multiculturalism that you can ever imagine. It's a port city. It was the window to the rest of the world. It's where people left to come to this country, to start new lives and, in places like they come from Ireland and everything and end up in New York. So the boats used to literally set sail from Liverpool. And because it was the biggest port city in not just England, it was one of the biggest ports in the world, like 300-400 years ago. actually there was such a consolidation of wealth that it was wealthier than London at one point, but it drew cultures in from all over the world. So to this day, it's quite a small city. You can drive it from one end to the other in like an hour, and everything's really accessible. But to this day, there's this real throbbing cultural melting pot of different cultures, people from different parts of the world, people from different backgrounds. But it might sound a bit corny, but being a Scouser, as we call it, or somebody from Liverpool, a Liverpudlian, if you will, it's a state of mind. And it doesn't matter where you're from, but as long as you've got that thing about you, that means that there's no edge to you, you want to integrate and you want to muck in, doesn't matter where you're from, you're one of ours.
So knowing that there's this overarching vibe to Liverpool with an anti-establishment bent to it, what's the legislation like there for psychedelic compounds in particular? Because it's easy to be in the United States and to be sort of tracking things that are happening in Portland or in Texas or in Missouri or in New York City. But I don't really know a whole lot about the landscape legislatively, parliamentarily speaking.
It's a shit show and embarrassingly behind the times. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this. So I was talking to a few people at the conference last week, and we were talking about just how behind the curve the UK is in a really weirdly paradoxical way. So some of the best research on psychedelics are happening in the UK. Imperial College London, people like Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris and others who are doing incredible work. And there is a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel because ketamine is legal for therapy.
All over the United Kingdom?
Yes. So there's actually Awaken clinics, which is run by Dr. Ben Sessa, who is making great strides in that world. However, the absurdity of it is this. MAPS basically have all of their MDMA, which is used for the therapy sessions and the clinical trials and everything that they've been doing. That gets manufactured in the UK. The biggest amount of medicinal grade cannabis for CBD oil and stuff like that, all grown in England.
Really? It's grown in England?
It's grown in England. And also as well, mushrooms are incredibly overabundant in England because it is really one of the indigenous medicines of that particular land. And they are illegal.
I don't know how many people think about England when they think about where mushrooms might be grown, but that's probably just not understanding the climatology and the...
Oh, dude, they just sprout up. They just sprout up. I literally went for a walk with a friend of mine in just outside of Manchester a few weeks ago. And like you couldn't walk 2 steps without seeing them just growing wild in a field. But if I got caught picking one of them out the ground, I'd get arrested.
Just picking it.
Just picking it.
Yeah. Has that happened to people that
it's
you've known
happened to
before?
people, yeah. Like there's hot spots where places, where mushrooms grow incredibly abundantly in places, certain parts of Wales, for example. And they get arrested. They get arrested for that stuff. And there's been efforts, and this is where the absurdity really ramps up to another level. The government a few weeks ago, our absolute shit show of a government, don't even start me on that, were actively and publicly discussing reclassifying cannabis as a Class A drug. Not 1 month ago. We're so behind the curve, it's embarrassing. And there's a reason for that. So it goes back to the breakthrough that happened in the counterculture at the end of the 80s with the rise of electronic music, the rise of acid house in particular. Because I don't know whether I said this on the panel, but the Brits were one of the first people who heard all of this incredible music coming out of Chicago and Detroit that made its way to England. And we were among the first people who went, do you know what would go really well with this music? Ecstasy. MDMA would go really well with this. And this massive countercultural revolution happened. And then there was a huge amount of scaremongering because the right-wing government of the day were actually really scared at one point that this counterculture was going to possibly overthrow the government. And that's where a lot of the fear came in, and there was some really brutal legislation that we're still dealing with the consequences of to this day. So we are horribly, hideously behind the curve. And especially now with Brexit, the decision to leave the European Medicines Agency is a really interesting situation because MAPS are at a certain point with FDA approval for MDMA. That hopefully will happen within the next year. the European Medicines Agency is only a year behind the FDA. They're the two tent poles which the rest of the world will hopefully use as the benchmark and the template for being able to legalize MDMA-assisted therapy in other countries. UK is not prepared for that on any level. And the conversation around MDMA and, certain other types of compounds hasn't moved on since the late 80s. There's still a lot of scaremongering in the press. There's still a lot of concern and media coverage. And it is starting to change. And it's going to have to change because, it's adapt or die, isn't it? And, amazing things are happening here. Amazing things are happening in other countries as well around use and access and therapy and everything else. And I just found it really interesting and kind of weirdly hypocritical in a way that we are both the home of some of the most draconian legislation out there, yet we're also the seat of some of the best research in the world. That just doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Yeah, somehow it's got to make sense. If we dug deep enough, maybe it would become crystal clear.
Yeah, there's probably a reason why, but then I think it's going to be a case of timing. Everything arrives when it's meant to happen, right? So I think it's just about being patient and allowing things to unfold, and it will eventually, ease up and we'll have some more access and everything else. So
you alluded to something that I was really excited to address with you today when you spoke to the idea that the people in your neighborhood recognized that there was a really great pairing available, this music with this modality, right, with this compound or these series of compounds. So I want to talk about that ephemeral thing of music and substance, right, and how the two work together. And just, it's hard to put your finger on, right, but people have a personal experience of music. Music is such a powerful force naturally, and it's something that I believe is very unifying for human beings. I think we all have the expression to want to make sound or to be with sound, and I love that aspect of the discussion that's occurring now is how can we engage sound, maybe something that we've taken for granted over time. How can we engage it differently for new possibilities, for healing and for transcendence, and to incorporate into meditation, incorporate into other aspects of our lives. But it's a very specific idea. You take this while you're doing this. Can you address like the roots of that fusion that you alluded to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it speaks to certain people who I really admire the work of. So specifically people like Jamie Wheel and Stephen Kotler, who are two of the foremost experts in the world on flow states. And there's an amazing book that they both wrote together called Stealing Fire.
Stealing Fire,
which came out a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, something like that. And they addressed just this thing about, well, what is it? Like, what is it about music, especially in a group setting? And why is it that we feel the need to consume and to interact with different compounds that can elevate the experience? And one of the things that they said, which I love, which is, humans are always trying to change the channel. They're always trying to shift their state. Get up in the morning, don't feel so good, meditate for 20 minutes, I feel better. Or I'm in a really bad mood, I'll go to a comedy club, see a great set, feel great afterwards. Like I really needed that. I'll go to a club, have a dance, I'll shake off whatever it is I need to shake off. State shift, right?
Read a book before bed, call a friend, eat a pear.
It's all about shifting the state, right? It's all about changing the channel on your consciousness. And we've been fascinated by that since the dawn of time. Whether you signed up to Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory or not, it's like we have a fascination with, as we say in England, getting off your chops and seeing what's outside of your perception, right? That very limited kind of laser-like channel that we all live in, what Graham Hancock calls alert, awake, problem-solving consciousness, which is massively needed and very necessary. But the real beautiful thing happens is when you get out of your own way and you allow things to come through that maybe wouldn't have come through. So, for me, where that comes from is from a need to communicate with the deepest parts of ourselves. That also predicates that there's something in the way. And yeah, you can call it ego or the mind or anything like that. But, it's that other saying, isn't it? The obstacle's the way. And if you can maneuver through that, and, to be completely clear, I'm a total hypocrite. I've never taken MDMA in my life. I had a very natural, visceral response to electronic music the first time I went to that club in 1998 as an 18-year-old. Man, I mean, to just sort of set the scene for a second, I'd been DJing. I've been learning to DJ for a while before I went clubbing. And I went to see a DJ called Paul Oakenfold, who is massively successful now. And he was actually resident at this club every week. And it was like a borderline. It was a religious experience. It was a spiritual breakthrough for me, as I mentioned in the panel. And just this music hit me and everything made sense.
What was Oakenfold doing that was so effective? Was it the fact that he was playing one song after another in a flow that sort of spoke?
And it was just these massive crashing moments of transcendence. Because he was playing that late 90s trance sound, which was my access point into electronic music.
Music that other people had made and that he had on vinyl and he was sharing.
Yeah, exactly, And was... he is a beautiful purveyor and tastemaker of that sound, and was at that moment, and it was a real peak. I mean, at that moment, he was the biggest DJ in the world. And as I said in the panel, like, it was the first time I went somewhere where I felt completely accepted. Like, I was profoundly bullied when I was a child. And going to that place, and for the first time, not just having the sense, but being told, you're good the way you are. Like, we accept you exactly as you are right now. And the music just moved through me in a way which is indescribable. And there's several reasons why I never interacted with MDMA at that point. One of them was that it was quite clear that I didn't need it. I just had an instantly very intuitive, incredibly profound experience with the music itself. So I met a bunch of friends who I still am friends with to this day on the dance floor that first night. And they were big partiers. Like, loved their MDMA, could go for 2 or 3 days. And the only problem with that is that I could match them blow for blow on water. And that was it. And the way I was the first person on the dance floor at 10 o'clock, and I was the last one off the dance floor at 6 o'clock in the morning. Completely natural, completely non-altered, shall we say. And very early on, while I was hanging with these guys, and I love these guys to this day, they took me to one side and said, listen, you don't need to take this. You don't need to interact with this. And if we find out that you have, we're going to disown you, because you are literally like the life and soul of the party as you are right now. So please, whatever you do, don't ever change.
They were speaking to you sincerely.
Sincerely, as people who cared deeply about me, and people who still cared about me deeply to this day.
Do you think they'd care about you if they weren't under the influence of MDMA?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
You had moments of camaraderie where that wasn't involved.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We sustained 20-plus year friendships, so of course that's going to be the case.
But they saw you. They were able to see you.
Saw me for what I was. And the way I explained it to a lot of people is like, I was naturally, for whatever reason, and I don't say this as somebody who I'm saying I'm better than anybody else or different to anyone else. I was just, the way I explained it was, I was almost waiting for everybody else's MDMA to kick in to get them in the elevator to come up to where I just happened to be naturally. So it was a very wild thing, and it's not until many years later that I understood that.
What are we talking about, Paul? We're talking about joy, right? Are we talking about joy? Are we talking what's at that level?
Completely unmanifest, like completely unadulterated.
Yeah.
Joy, unity. You're just a channel for whatever it is that needs to come through you. There's no friction. There's no opposition. There's no resistance. It just is.
And the music was integral to getting to that point.
The music was the thing that opened the door.
Yeah.
And then that's where my fascination with music and sound went into overdrive. And it was not only I need to share what I have by presenting music in this way. So I got into it and I like to say this, I got into this music for a lot of the right reasons, 1 or 2 of the wrong reasons. But the right reasons where I just want to share how I feel with other people. Yeah. And I want people to feel what I feel. I want to be able to create a container for presenting music. I don't like the word perform. When something's performative, there's an insinuation that it's fake. I like the idea of offering. I like the idea of presenting, creating a door that people can open, bring whatever baggage that they need to bring with them, because by the time they go back through that door, they're going to leave that baggage there, let it go. They never need to think about it again. Like they've dissolved, right? And that is what was happening for me on a very, very real level. And some of the other reasons why I chose not to interact with MDMA or ecstasy at that point was, like I mentioned before, legislatively, it was deeply illegal. That wasn't in my mind frame at all, whether or not, I'm breaking the law, not bothered about that. It was just that the drugs were so illicit. The MDMA was so illicit that it wasn't often guaranteed what was in with the MDMA. Mm-hmm. So I'd seen some people have some deeply problematic experiences because it turns out that they'd taken pills that had been laced with like heroin, fentanyl, rat poison, brick dust, all sorts of things that you would not put in your body. Mm-hmm. And I just decided it wasn't worth the risk. But predominantly it was because I didn't want to insert a third party between me and the music. Mm. And I've seen a lot of my friends chase the dragon, where they had an incredible first experience and then they spent the next 5 years of their life building up a tolerance towards compounds like MDMA and then trying to just chase it in order to try and get back to that first experience. And I decided that wasn't really for me. And what really helped me to understand and contextualize that experience was nearly 6 years ago now. I had my first psychedelic experience, and that explained the entire route of how I've got to where I am today.
It explained the route. There's so much I want to ask you, Paul. Before we get to the explanation of the route, I wanted you to speak to the relationship between the DJ and the creator of the what's being DJ'd, right? Like the music, because the what Oakenfold was spinning and what affected you so deeply was being created by someone somewhere with technology that was a little maybe harder to do it than it is
At
now,
that point,
possibly.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what were the creators of the music tapping into? What was your relationship being in Liverpool, hearing the stuff that was resonating, but maybe not having as easy access to creators and profiles and knowledge of performers as we do now?
It was incredibly exciting because, back then, like you mentioned, it wasn't as easy as it is these days,
Just to find out information.
Oh my God, yeah. And so when I first tried to start making that music myself, it was like you were tapping into some sort of like black art where nobody wants to share secrets because you might employ a technique that I did on this record and, all this stuff. And it was highly secretive. And it was like, I don't know, it was almost like a kind of a, secret cult of people who were making this music, Well,
let's really break it down. We're talking about music with beats and music that's made with keyboards specifically.
Synthesizers, fully electronic music. Mm-hmm. And, back then it was all hardware and hardware samplers, hardware drum machines, hardware synthesizers, that kind of thing. And the computer was basically there as like a giant tape machine to record what it was you were doing in the moment. So it was very, very difficult to learn. You didn't know that many people who could do it. And it was like this secretive world. Like, we're talking about a world before YouTube. It's kind of hard to imagine not being able to go on YouTube because it hadn't been invented yet. Yeah. And there were certain magazines that kind of give away certain things. But you had to know someone. You had to know someone who was willing to sit there with you and explain it. And those people were very, very rare. So I think what they were picking up on from my experience is that they were trying to channel and interpret and recommunicate their own experiences of their transcendent states and their spiritual breakthroughs. And that was their attempt at being able to share that with everyone and then handing that to people like the Paul Oakenfolds and the Sashas of this world, who then would program an entire evening's worth of entertainment with that being the stated intention. There was a lot less ego back then. It was a little bit more Wild West, and we were kind of just making it up as we were going along because there was no phones, there was no cameras, there was no such thing as social media. You had to be there. You know, if you were lucky, you had like a Polaroid or like a fun size camera that you managed to get some blurry shots of the night at the end of it, but mostly you had to go on your own recollection. So interestingly, these days, it's more the DJ and the person making the music are often the same person now. So there's a much more direct route, because the way the industry's developed is that you have to, in order to break through as a DJ, as a performer, that word again, you have to be making your own music, and you have to be signed to the right record labels and be getting played by the right people, and then that needs to blow up on social media. It's a whole ecosystem now from, you know, what is now a mature part of the music industry, which has got great advantages, one or two problems. So it's really interesting because there was a purity of connection, because the Maps party that I played on Saturday night in Miami last week, you know, I was prone to dropping one or two of the classics because, you know, you read the room and you play the crowd, right? And I was really reflecting on that on the plane over here to LA. It's like, what is it about these records from back then? Why do we keep going back to them? Why do they contain a specific feeling that a lot of modern music doesn't seem to have? That's an open question that I'm still trying to arrive at some sort of understanding of, because I would like to be able to channel whatever it is that was in that old Deep Dish remix or that old Acid House classic. I would like to be able to create a modern version of that.
Are composers working in the electronic field, are they more prone to seeking transcendent states or being interested in mystical experiences? You think it's just the type of person who is going to be prone to sitting down with learning how to work a drum machine and synthesizers when they're 19 or 20? Like what's happening? Everybody's into something different, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Are they mystics? You have to be a mystic to be an electronic music creator?
I mean, I don't think you have to be, but I think it helps. Right. And I think you have to be very open. And, you know, as I say, my route was a classic case of just being incredibly open to everything that comes, not realizing the context until much later on, which I think is really healthy. You know, I think we have a tendency to maybe be a little bit too self-aware and often ask questions about why is this happening? And I'd love this to happen. And, you know, I want this. And, you know, how do I make this happen? And there's a degree of like almost like manipulation to try and get what you want. Whereas like if you just stop thinking for a while, which I know is easier said than done, and get out your own way, like it'll happen. And in fact, like you don't need to try. You don't need to do anything. Like it's already done. Like there's nothing to do. You just need to position yourself correctly. So yeah, it's really interesting because I do think genuinely some DJs have a connection to something far greater than ourselves. I've met all of my heroes. I've worked with most of them. And they've all got one thing in common. They've got this connection to something that you can't quite put your finger on what it is. Whether it's something higher, something unexplainable. They're tapped into a source of energy that we all have come from and we're all going back to at the end of our lives. And they somehow become a hollow bone is what some Native American cultures call it, where you're completely empty and you're just a vessel, a channel for whatever it is that needs to come through.
Well, not all music is based in a consistent rhythm or beat, right? But there's something about certain styles of music where the beat, the pulse is consistent and metered and predominant throughout the piece, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think maybe in a very, let's get musically nerdy about it. On a certain level, you can think of the heartbeat, right? Like everything inside of everybody, we have that consistent pulse, right? So that's a very kind of grounding idea. It's like centering in, feeling your heart and the resonance there. And that's in the electronic music, the 4 on the floor, or whatever that reality is, right? And it's in like drum circles, and it's that consistent pulse, right? How do you get a person who's never been to a dance hall or a rave or just any kind of music where there's event where there's dancing and everybody's on the same page? Like, you know, it would be great if there was easier access to something like that where a person could just casually come into that context. But it almost seems like you have to really be either geared for it or really already acquainted with it. I wish there was more dancing to beats around.
I think we are, and we've just forgotten it.
Yeah.
So there's a few things to what you were saying there, and I can break them down. So there's a reason why the consistency works, and it's to do with, heart and brain coherence, and, it's a bit like, those, when you see, those like executive toys with the balls that, and then all of a sudden it's like, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and then it'll just perpetually go, right?
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. Or, you see it in like, when two tuning forks, one resonates, the other one will it's sympathetic resonance basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what that's all about. There's an amazing book that I read about it. It's very academic, but it's absolutely beautiful. And it's called Inner Sound. And it's by a guy called Dr. Jonathan Weinall. And it is literally it's the manual on how do you induce extraordinary states of consciousness through audio and visual means. And that was a real influence on me in terms of contextualizing what I do and what we all do as electronic music producers and DJs naturally and instinctively without thinking about it, and then understanding the true power of it, and then how to leverage that in order to make people have an optimal experience. One of the things I'm fascinated by is like, how can I help people, whether it's me in the studio or me in a DJ booth somewhere, how do I help someone feel better walking off a dance floor than when they walked on? And that's something that the industry's maybe lost sight of a little bit in terms of the effect on the nervous system, what kind of intention or what kind of vibration, if you want to use that word, what are you putting out there? Are you doing that consciously or unconsciously? And is that going to lead to people having an optimal experience or maybe a more challenging experience? Because, I can speak to it, if a DJ's in the wrong frame of mind and has the, less than a great intention for their set, like they can put people in a really weird place.
Yeah, sound can be intensive. If I screamed at you right now, the natural physiological reaction wouldn't be pleasurable necessarily.
Correct. And it's all going on in the nervous system. And I mentioned this in the panel that I spoke on at Wonderland about, there is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, and music and sound has the absolute capability to put you in either one of those states, fight or flight or rest and digest. Guess which one is the more optimal, right? And it's quite interesting because, musical styles in Europe have definitely gotten darker and faster and harder in recent years. And, often I think that's a function of my age being the wrong side of 40 now, or the other side of 40, I should say, because there's no right or wrong side. But there is definitely something going on there where there's a lack of awareness and a lack of intention. So that's kind of what I'm trying to move the needle on a little bit when I work with artists, because I do a lot of artist development work as well. It's helping people to understand their responsibility as artists and what they're doing, because they literally hold people's spirituality and their nervous systems in their hands. So it's a deeply fascinating thing. So, this book, Inner Sound, was absolutely pivotal in helping me to fully understand, the responsibility that I have.
What's the link between the nervous system and spirituality? That's an interesting allusion you just made. I understand what you mean when you say it, but what could you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's the vessel which drives these, meat wagons that we have around. It's like that silly meme that people, often share. It's like, you're a ghost driving a meat-covered skeleton on a rock that's doing 1,000,000 miles an hour around the sun. What have you got to be afraid of, right? And, the nervous system is the primary means by which we move our bodies and interact with the world. It's like you think about the vagus nerve, for example. It's the single biggest nerve in the body, and it's connected to the eyes all the way down to your butthole. And it almost controls every major system in the body. And, you can, through various different means, breath work, dance, yoga, all of these things, you can put them in one or two places, And evolutionarily speaking, if you want to take an evolutionary biology perspective, we're all born with two major fears. One is of heights, so you don't accidentally fall off a cliff, and loud noises, so you don't get eaten by a tiger in the jungle, right? Or, you don't get stuck in an earthquake or something like that. And we still have those things. And having an awareness of those things is the doorway towards either being incredibly closed off to spirituality because you're too busy trying to survive. So you're in your survival mechanism, which is your fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system. Or you're in a more open state, which makes you relaxed, makes you inquire more, and that's the parasympathetic state. And obviously the parasympathetic state is the more optimal state for personal discovery, for growth, for integration, all of that good stuff. But obviously we need the parasympathetic, we need the sympathetic as well, because we need that to survive, essentially. But modern life kind of mostly puts us in that fight or flight state. Various means, media, caffeine, alcohol, nicotine, other compounds and other drugs that we could talk about, other ways of shifting our consciousness that result in a net more challenging day-to-day existence. Whereas a lot of the compounds, molecules that we were learning about at Wonderland and, you know, I've had experiences with, produce the opposite effect. They're very challenging at the initial, but over the long term, they're incredibly beneficial.
Well, let's talk about the effect of compounds and the relationship with music again in the context of the container that you're creating with the Microdose Music Project. You're obviously a steward of sound and a curator of good vibes. So talk about how you're integrating a certain style of music into a particular container so that it can be accessed in a way with a very particular end goal.
Yeah. So this is one of the most beautiful parts of my burgeoning relationship with Microdose is Richard Scaife again came to me a couple of months ago and said, do you know what would be really good is if I can get back into the music game because I miss it. How do you think a record label would work? And I've been part of a reasonably successful underground dance music label in recent years. And when he kind of hit me with the idea of let's do a label that is specifically for functional music and psychedelic assisted therapy, it was a total no-brainer. Like, and when I thought about it, I was like, my God, like there's such a need for that type of music, because speaking to a lot of therapists in Miami last week, it's a great opportunity to speak to people who are on the front lines, actually doing the work, whether it's with MAPS or any of these other clinics or clinical trials. And the one thing that was a consistent through line is that the thing we struggle with the most is music.
The thing who struggles with?
As in...
The practitioner, the clinician?
The clinician, as in the selection of music. So say, for example, Johns Hopkins University, in their trials and in their programs, insist on only classical music because that's their background. And don't get me wrong, I like classical music. I love, you know, Shostakovich and, you know, all these beautiful classical composers. I love it. But that's not for everyone, right? There's a...
very little music is for everyone.
Well, exactly. Because, and actually all the best music is not for everyone, right? Because it's a highly subjective thing. But the understanding of there's a need for music specifically created with that intention in mind.
A texture as part of the process.
An intention, a narrative, so people can be guided through an experience is absolutely huge. And, you know, really what I think we've been working towards this, and I think it's a very instinctive part of the process. So, you know, I've done a lot of ayahuasca ceremonies in the last 6 years. And one of my sort of things that I say that I'm only half joking about is all the best DJs I know are actually ayahuasca shamans, because they've got the same thing that a DJ's got. They know when to play the exact right piece of music at the exact right time that you didn't realize to optimize your experience.
Are you talking about the Icaros in particular?
The Icaros, the music that people channel through these medicines, that they then write themselves, songs that are effectively downloaded from wherever it is they come from. And there is just nothing like it. There's this quintessence. There's this beautiful moment when, you know, a medicine keeper or somebody's holding the space for, I mean, I've done ceremonies with like 60, 70 people, and it's wild. And then at the right moment when the right song is played or somebody drops the right record and it turns into like a group dance. It's absolutely beautiful. There's absolutely nothing like it. Or the song that you don't want to hear that brings on the purge, but you needed it in that moment. It's the thing that helps you break through what it is that you need to be working with. And it's deeply challenging, but also deeply supportive. It's taking you there in a deeply loving way. And that is what I've tried to imbue in the first Microdose music release, which is my debut album as an artist. And it's
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's been a bit of a wild ride to get that ready in just under 3 weeks. It was. Wow. So, an artist who I absolutely adore and I'm now sort of like, tangentially connected to through, I've spoken to his management and I've connected them to maps, is John Hopkins.
Yeah, we just had a listening session of the album recently here in
Los
Angeles.
Music for psychedelic therapy, yeah. So that was obviously an influence, and that has kind of opened the doors to this whole realm of music in service to these experiences, but also can be used every day. It can be used by yoga teachers in classes. Like, I'm a qualified yoga instructor. And one of the things that I'm intending to do when I return to England is to actually teach some yin yoga classes, and I'm going to use my album as the backdrop. To give like a 49 minute to an hour experience of moving through a flow where even some good deep work can be done in the context of holding the body in certain positions. So it's an incredible opportunity to not only, open things up and open up a whole new realm of intentional music. It's also an amazing opportunity to create something that like hasn't existed before, which is music with a deep intention and music that will help people very, very specifically. So the album has a very specific narrative. It's nearly an hour long, and it was done with this intention in mind of, it's going to take you down into some places that maybe you don't want to go, but you need to go in order to be able to let go of some things that aren't serving you and to be able to emerge on the other side of that process a little lighter, but much better.
The album was created to be listened to all at once as part of a therapeutic experience with
Correct.
Potentially with psychedelics. And so you're composing the work of electronic music and you're guiding it through a storyline in your mind, right? So to you, that piece of music would work for all 10 people who are listening to it in the same way, or all 100 people who are listening to it in the same way? How does that? What's your belief based on your own experiences of what the listener's experience will be of the music?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I've been asked this a lot, because I did some interviews after my performance on the Friday at Wonderland. For those of you who haven't seen it, it is a immersive experience based with a surround sound system, a next generation surround sound system, which I've been working on with a German company called D&B Audio Technik for the last 5 years. The whole thing is designed to be as immersive as possible. And there's audio reactive visuals, which are based on my movement and also the movement and the cadence of the music. So the whole thing is designed to be like a transporting experience. It's not designed to make everybody feel the same way, because how could you? As you said earlier in the conversation, like, music is a deeply subjective thing, and different things work for different people. And like we said, all the best music is not for everyone. I was really inspired by an interview I heard with Hans Zimmer, and I've been lucky enough to be in and around his building and meet some of the people who he works with. Dear friend of mine, Junkie XL, who I've worked with, incredible music composer, who I've had the honour of working with, and a few other people in that world. And Hans said with his film scores, what he's trying to do is open a door to a world. And it's intentionally opaque and non-specific. And what, as an audience member, that you're meant to do, which is ironically very similar to electronic music, is you are meant to bring your baggage in through that door and project onto that music whatever it is that you need it to be. So not only have I created this album from that idea of opacity and being incredibly non-specific, because film music can be deeply manipulative, right? In fact, some of the best film music is highly manipulative. You know, think about the way Steven Spielberg and John Williams use music in films. That it is very much
John Carpenter.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it is like, this is what you should be feeling right now. The idea of this is not to do that at all. So what you do is that you create a very open container that allows people to project onto it, like whatever it is that they need to project onto it. And then over time, their relationship to this music will transform and change and undergo evolution, and they'll hear things in it that they've never heard before because they're a different person to what they were before. And the music itself is designed specifically to be non-specific and allow for people to find out different things about themselves. And the music is meant to be a mirror for that. So it's not trying to tell you what to feel. It's just, here's the mood, here's the texture, here's the intention of it. Just allow this to wash over you, and different things will come at different times. And it's here to support you on an ongoing basis. And it may well end up supporting you for the rest of your life, which is what I would love for it to do.
I want to talk about that non-specific nature, and I want to relay an anecdote to you, if I may. I had my first ketamine-assisted psychotherapy session about a year ago. And in the lead up to actually having the day where I took the medicine, part of the questioning leading up to that from the therapist was basically, do you have any strong attachment to any kind of music in particular? And I'm like, I have strong attachments to every kind of music, you know? Like I've always been deep into music. So I felt bad because I couldn't really answer her question very clearly. I have a feeling about everything. So, and particularly with electronic music, I've been a fan of ambient electronic music for a long time. I have a playlist that I created. I used to live in New York City, and there were I'm prone to having anxiety attacks in certain atmospheres, or at least I was earlier in life. And that playlist was something I leaned on very hard. I considered that playlist to be medicine for real, right? Like, especially being on the subway for extended periods of time, getting off work late, traveling an hour underground with stoppages and frustration and antagonism, whatever, right? I could go to particular records and heal. You know, I could rebound with particular augmentation from music. And so electronic music has always been particularly important to me. So I couldn't answer her questionnaire very effectively, showed up for the day of the administration of the medicine, and basically laid down on the couch, covered up with a blanket and a blindfold, and was subjected to some of the worst techno I've ever heard.
Oh my God.
So it was about 3 hours of like really rank, just kind of generic electronic music, and it was not what I would have selected for myself. I feel like I was at a disadvantage because I would have liked to have DJ'd the experience for myself. But when you're talking about the researchers at Johns Hopkins and relying on classical, you know, I mean, classical for some people, for some maybe not, it has a certain like, you can couch it in a context, right? Or an era, or whatever that means. Like, what does the aristocracy mean? Or who owns the land? You know, what... It's different for everybody. Again, subjectivity in music, right? So if you're talking about, and I had an experience of bad techno music during this, what was hoped to be a mystical experience. So if you're composing music, it's a large charge, isn't it? To create music like you're just talking about is rather amorphous or not necessarily like deciding any moment for you. I had no choice but to be subjected to like whatever the intention of that generic techno music was, you know? How do you make sure that you're really like maximizing the opportunity in composing? And when you're looking at growing the body of work with the label, like how do you look at that prospect?
Yeah, it's about feeling into authenticity, I think, more than anything. And through the creative process for this album, it was a really interesting thing because, like, I'll level with you, none of this music existed a month ago, because the opportunity only came up about 4 weeks ago. So I was placed in a position where it was like, you know, as we say in Liverpool, it's shit or get off the pot. You know, you've
That was your first swear this whole time we've been talking, by the way. I
God
was
damn it.
counting. I was looking to see if maybe we were going to break the finish line.
Well, we'll make sure that's we'll ramp up the profanity quotient before we finish.
Whatever your heart's desire.
Exactly. So yeah, it was, as I say, it was do it. You've got no choice. You also don't have the luxury of overthinking this.
Yeah, it's fun to create sometimes when you have a specific mandate and a window of opportunity. It's
Yeah. And I'm always at my best in those situations.
Yeah.
When it's like, it's what I read this in an amazing book by Robert Greene called Mastery. I'm a big Robert Greene fan. 48 Laws of Power, Art of Seduction, 33 Strategies of War. And Mastery was one of the books that changed my life because it helped me to understand what it would take to be a master of what your life's work is meant to be. And the Chinese used to call it death ground. So they would train by placing a small battalion of soldiers with their backs to a cliff, and then another battalion would attack them. And it was that case of, well, I'm either going to come out fighting or I'm going over the edge. And that's when I really am at my best. And it's gnarly and it's uncomfortable and there's altogether unnecessary amount of cortisol involved, mostly, but in this process not. It was really interesting. Like I mentioned before, I alluded to being out of my own way, and what I realized very early in the process, I had that initial thought process of shit, I'm gonna have to pull this out of my arse at 3 weeks notice, and then I was like, no, hang on, you've been preparing for this for years. Everything that you have done up to this point has been preparing you for this. All the experimentation, all the knowledge, all the experience, all the people you've worked with, all your ideas, everything you want to create is all leading up to this moment. So you're all good. You've got everything you need. That helped me out of my own way and just allow it to happen. And the better part of that process was just allowing things to be. So I was speaking to a friend of mine earlier who's an amazing guy. And he actually really helped me with my first experiences with 5-MeO-DMT earlier this year. Absolutely beautiful person. And as I said to him, I had to be okay with just actually saying, no, that's good. What artists would normally do. Fiddle with it, tweak it, refine it. And sooner or later, you'll pull the wrong card out of the house of cards and the whole thing collapses, right? Because it's your ego that needs to tweak it, and it's your ego that needs to manipulate it and refine it into a certain shape. One of the tracks on the album is literally me playing a 9.5-minute piece of just playing one synthesizer sound and having a spoken word vocal over the top. And that manifested and was created in the space of 1 hour in my studio. And I had to sit there and go, no, that's okay, done. And then the imposter syndrome kicks in of, can't be that easy, can it? It's like, well, yeah, it can, if you allow it to be that easy, because that's clearly what needed to come through at this moment. Just allow it to happen. Don't overthink it. In fact, don't think, I'm working with an absolutely beautiful psychotherapist in England, Charmaine Berry, big shout out to her. And she's been really helping me with a breakthrough in terms of non-duality. Understanding that as we sit here right now, Matthew, me and you, we're the same thing. We're just reflections of the same thing, looking at each other, having an experience of separation, ultimately realizing that we're both the same thing. And it's been a really, really interesting process because she's really helped me to be out of my own way and to just, as I say, just become completely neutral and completely hollow and just allow for that to come through.
I want to ask you, what has gone right in your life to get you to this moment?
My God, how long have you got?
Tell me something that really resonates for you when you think back about the things that make you joyful in your life, the things that empower you. What
Just
resonates?
Pure synchronicity. Not a believer in coincidences. In fact, I'm creating a burgeoning list of things that don't exist. It's quite a long list now. Things that we get overly taken up in, I literally said this to somebody this morning who I'm mentoring because he had a demo rejected by a record label and he was feeling a bit rejected. One of the big things that I don't think exists is rejection. Rejection is the ego's interpretation of redirection to where you're meant to be. It just appears because who's hurt? Who's wounded? The ego's wounded. You know, our imagination of our own self-image, right? So for me, in terms of what makes amazing, super joyful, like incredible experiences is when there's just a beautiful confluence and beautiful synchronization of different things. The thing that immediately comes to mind is my first meeting with Rick Doblin. So this remains one of the wildest experiences of my entire life. So October just gone, 2021, I am at a friend of mine's party in London, amazing DJ called Lee Burridge, one of my oldest friends. I've known him for nearly 25 years. Beautiful party called All Day I Dream, which is very highly aligned to this world. Beautiful, melodic, organic music that really opens people up in a gorgeous way. So I go to this party in London and I'm on my way back home to Liverpool, and it's about a 2.5 hour train ride back up to Liverpool from London. It's about 200 miles away in the northwest. For whatever reason, I decided to get off at King's Cross station because the other station that I need to get my train from is London Euston, which is a nice 5-10 minute walk. It was a beautiful day and I was like, I'll get off here and I'll just walk. And I had a MAPS t-shirt on, the Psychedelic Research Department t-shirt that you can buy from their website. Because 4 months previously, when I was in Portugal learning to surf, I was watching the Joe Rogan podcast and it was with Rick Doblin and Joe had one of those t-shirts on. So I immediately bought one because I thought that's a great t-shirt legitimately and it's a great way to donate to MAPS. Amazing podcast. And I thought to myself when I was watching it, Joe, I'd love to work with MAPS because there's just something about being able to build a bridge between the electronic music world and what MAPS do. So I'm walking down the street in London with this t-shirt on. I'm walking down the road, minding my own business. I get to a crossing, like a pedestrian crossing, and I look immediately to my left and Rick Doblin was stood next to me. And he looked at me and he said, you've got one of our t-shirts on. And I looked at him and went, you're Rick fucking Doblin. And we stood at the side of the road for half an hour talking about music, talking about the role it can have, they were doing with MAPS and how it's extending outside of America now to places like the UK and in Europe. And we both exited that conversation knowing that that meant something. Like, how can it not mean something? Lo and behold, a few months later, I now help MAPS building that bridge to electronic music. In a voluntary capacity, I work as an ambassador for MAPS into the music industry, trying to create connections between well-known artists, be able to raise awareness, raise funds to help support what MAPS do to help accelerate the transition into the mainstream through culture. And that is one of the things that brings me the most joy. So at Miami, it was also a significant thing because Rick was there and it was the first time I'd seen him since that day.
Nice.
And Rick saw me and the first thing he did is just like give me the biggest hug. And it was just a beautiful moment. And he looked at me and he said to me, Paul, I am still completely mind blown by that moment. He said, I'll never forget it. And look at the significance. And a year later, I'm headline DJ in a MAPS fundraiser at Wonderland.
If it's okay to use the word synchronicities, you can say that being aware of synchronicity in your life has helped lead you to where you are now, and which seems to me to be a place of mental, spiritual, emotional wellness. Always a work in progress, right?
Absolutely.
But landing in some pretty great opportunities that are fulfilling to you and that bring you joy. So maybe you would tell somebody listening to this or watching this now that if they haven't been thinking about synchronicity much before, maybe it's a good idea to just kind of be aware of the idea or read something about it or try to be mindful. Because I think it's one of those sorts of things that once you start to recognize it happening around you, it could facilitate it happening.
100%. And I think one of the ways that we can do this, and you don't need psychedelics to do this, you know?
This is part of the overall holistic conversation here. Psychedelics is an access point to flow state and consciousness and the exploration.
They're accelerators for those things. And, you know, as I think it was Stan Groff called them, non-specific amplifiers, right? Whatever is already in you, it will amplify whatever it's there. And that's all the bad and all the good, you know? So, you know, for me, it's not about whether or not you take mushrooms or, you know, smoke toad venom or whatever. It's more about an openness. And one of the things that psychedelics do, and other aspects like yoga and meditation and all these great things, what they do is like they kind of like widen your peripheral vision. You know, like alert, awake, problem-solving consciousness that's often caffeine-driven in our society tends to sharpen the focus down. And we need that, right, to be able to do deep work. But in order to allow the synchronicities to happen, there's a couple of things you've got to do. You've got to widen your peripheral vision through things like meditation and letting go of whatever it is that's, you know, holding you back, because we're only really holding ourselves back at the end of the day. I said this to my friend before, you know, one of my big realizations recently, to use a video game analogy, is that there is no final boss. You know, there's no big bad to overcome at the end of it, you know, and I think a lot of people like to pretend that it's their own egos. And I think we get misdirected. You know, I mean, I love Ryan Holiday's work, but one thing that I always found really problematic is the title of his book called The Ego is the Enemy. It's like, what, you're making an enemy of part of yourself? It's no way to integrate. You know, you're actually vilifying and casting out and ostracizing a very important part of yourself that, when you're in correct relation to it, is an incredibly powerful ally. I mean, try getting up in the morning and tying your shoelaces and wiping your arse without it, you know? But that understanding of just opening that peripheral vision out. And then the other thing is like, so there's a width and then there's also a depth, right? So one of the things I learned a few years ago, which allowed a lot of these synchronicities to happen for me, was that I was pushing into a space that life was trying to arrive in, and I was blocking it from happening because my lizard brain, the one that schemes, the one that has plans, as the Joker says in Dark Knight, you know, the one that wants to manipulate to get what they want, is operating in that space. It's what David Hawkins calls power versus force. So I was forcing it. I was trying to force square pegs into round holes in various areas of my life. And when I learned not to do that, and how counterproductive it was, and the fact that what life was trying to bring me was infinitely superior to what I was trying to manipulate to get, I took a step back. And then the synchronicity started to come because I'm both wide from a peripheral vision point of view. So again, like if my peripheral vision wasn't wide on a very practical way, I might have walked past Rick Doblin and never met him. And, you know, arguably I wouldn't be sat here now having this conversation because I would never have gone to Wonderland. I would never have done what I've done. We wouldn't have met. I wouldn't be sat here right now. And then the depth aspect of just taking that step back and realizing that there is nothing to do. You know, one of my hot takes is that I think hard work is bullshit.
You think what?
Hard work is bullshit. Like, it's massively overrated. And I say this to a lot of the artists that I develop. If you are finding the creation of music hard work, you're doing it wrong. There's something off here. You know, and we live in this bullshit hustle culture, you know, where there's all these people like, you know, Gary Vee and all this stuff. And it's like hustle and work 23 hours a day. And I tried that. I nearly fucking killed myself in the process. I burnt out so hard I didn't know what way was up. And it's about realizing that it's already done. You're just along for the ride. You just got to witness it. You just got to observe it and allow it to happen with a faith of understanding that what's for you. My dad always used to say this. I lost my dad nearly 6 years ago. He always said to me, Paul, what's for you doesn't go past you. And it's so true. It's so true. And I hate how right he was in that situation, you know?
6 years ago, which brings me back to, and I want to be respectful of your time and the audience's time as well, but at the beginning of our conversation, we discussed how in your early days in the music scene that you weren't utilizing the compounds like those around you were.
Sure.
And I think you mentioned that it was 6 years ago that you began a new phase of life where you incorporated psychedelics into your practice, right? So everything we've talked about today is set in a life experience where you were you, and that's the way you were, and whatever was going in and coming out was you. And then at a certain point, potentially 6 years ago, some new colors came in, and maybe that's affected some outlook, some feelings, some expression, right? So before you go, if you would speak to the experience of making the conscientious decision to begin experiencing.
Yes, very particular part of my life. So one thing we've not discussed, because I know you've mentioned that you've only moved to LA in July this year, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, I lived here previously. I lived here from 2015 to 2017 and had some of the best times of my life. But this place well and truly chewed me up and spat me out. And I went through a very, very dark time in my life. I had a very, very, very painful breakup with somebody who I loved very much at the time. And that was the catalyst. You know, there was that one breakup that everybody goes through that shatters you into a million pieces. And this was the one where I just couldn't quite put myself back together again, and I couldn't understand why. Because normally when I have setbacks, I'm pretty good at bouncing. You know, I normally bounce off the wall and keep going. I hit the wall, didn't bounce, and slid down the wall and stayed there in a heap. And a very dear friend of mine called Gavin, who was a DJ, still is to an extent, but had been very much in this world. I bumped into him at my friend's health food shop close to where I live in Liverpool. And ayahuasca had been tapping me on the shoulder for about 3 years previously, because I also went through a divorce as well in 2013 to 2016, just going through that whole process. And progressively, through people like Graham Hancock and other things I was listening to, like, this was tapping me on the shoulder, and I knew it was something that I had to do. And Gavin created the opportunity. So I was living here. I flew back for Christmas, but then December of 2016, I find myself in a car 24 hours after he speaks to me. I book a flight home. I'm in a car on the way to the deepest forest in the southeast coast of England. And I end up having my first experience with ayahuasca, which completely changed my life. Completely. Like, I refer to my life almost in, like, you know, people like in the media, they talk about pre and post 9/11. It's like, it's that level to me. It's like the me up until December 19th, 2016 feels like a different person compared to who I am now. And I've shed many different versions of myself since through intense work. You know, I've done probably about 30 ayahuasca sessions up to now, ceremonies, and interactions with other compounds as well, with like iboga and mushrooms and San Pedro and peyote and
any of those things before that first ayahuasca?
Never. That was the first thing that I ever took that shifted my perception in any way. So it's a bit like me. It's like, you know, I do things either 100 or 0.
And ayahuasca to you was 100.
Yeah, it was like 100,000, basically, in the intensity of the experience. And the way that I explain myself in terms of trying to navigate my first experience was I felt a bit like Boris Johnson trying to fly a fighter jet. It was like not happening. It was just this wild ride where I just got pulled through the back end of the universe.
Were you afraid going into the experience?
Terrified. Absolutely terrified. And I sat and drank the first cup thinking, I need to know who I am on the other side of all this fear. I need to know. I need to know who I am on the other side of all this trauma. All of this pain that I'm in, that I'm carrying around like a backpack, and I don't know how to let it go. I don't know how to shed it. And it absolutely helped me do that over the course of 2 ceremonies and 2 nights. One of the most incredible, exquisite, terrifying, profound, wonderful, shocking, scary, and deeply healing experiences in my entire life. And I literally walked out of that ceremony, or those 2 ceremonies, that retreat, looking like 10 years younger. Like, I went in looking like I had the weight of the world on my shoulders, because I did. And that helped me just shed it all and help me access deeper parts of myself. And I went into it maybe a little bit arrogant. There's a funny story about it, because I basically did like the schoolboy 101 error when it comes to like taking any form of compound. I drank the first cup and sat there for 90 minutes and didn't feel anything. And I went up and got a second cup, and then within 5 minutes, The second cup slammed into the first cup, and that was it. But that's exactly what I needed, because I wasn't surrendering. I had to be surrendered. And surrender me it did. And it's changed everything. And as I said, I was a little bit arrogant going into it because, I'm a deeply nerdy audio engineer. I've taught it to, undergraduate university level. I can talk to you about acoustics and psychoacoustics and physics and everything till the cows come home. I thought I knew all there was to know about music. But that first experience showed me I knew absolutely roughly fuck all. And somebody said it to me a few years later, said to me, Paul, when you turn away from source, you lose the ability to learn. And I turned away from source because it was just too painful, from that unity place, that point where we all come from, that place that we're all going back to when we pass. If you believe in the concept of death, personally, that's under negotiation for me at the moment. And it just really, really introduced me to a whole realm that I never knew existed, that I was deeply ignorant towards. And that contextualizes my earlier experiences with music and the refusal, not the refusal, but the conscious choice to not interact with MDMA, because I went into that ayahuasca ceremony for the first time completely naive to the process. And that's exactly what I needed. So it justified, contextualized, explained all of those conscious choices, because everything was leading up to that moment.
I'm excited for people to be able to experience what you're going to do with microdose music. If someone wants to learn more about it, how do they do that?
Yes, we have already made the announcement that the label is coming next year. The album, which is called Dissolve, is going to be out early 2023. What people heard there is very much version 1, and the live show is very much a version 1, and the feedback's been amazing. So I'm going to head back to the UK and refine that and perfect it. And the label will be launching early 2023. If people want to know more, you can go to, quite simply, microdose.buzz, because that's an incredible resource of information on research and what's going on in this incredibly exciting new space. And obviously, Wonderland 2023 is absolutely going to happen. And we've got very, very big plans for that, not just for the conference, but on the music side as well. The music side is going to be very, very exciting and massively upgraded for 2023. In fact, we're kind of starting to call it Miami Psychedelic Week and Wonderland is going to be just one part of that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for being open to the things that happen as they happen, right? It's a pleasure to meet you, and thanks for making whatever needed to happen so that we could have this conversation today.
Me too. I'm really, really glad I overdosed on psilocybin chocolate this morning to be able to be so open to actually have this conversation in a deeply flowing state. I very nearly didn't make it, quite frankly. I was texting my partner, Sari, here, and I was like this morning going, I'm just breathing outside of a cafe here. Like, literally, so thank you to Sari for driving me over here, because I was definitely not safe for controlling a vehicle at one stage. But by the time I arrived in the state that I'm meant to be to have this beautiful conversation with you, Matthew, and I really, really appreciate the opportunity.